session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Riley Adams and Michael OLaughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge. Welcome to the Hedgerows, and today we've got a special request from Roxanne, who asked us about how did Brian Boru rise to power, and then we started talking about the Vikings. So we're going to include a couple of things here at the Hedge School on Brian Boru and the Vikings, and today we are going to take on the Vikings, and class is just about ready to start. This would be the 2-minute warning, and Patrick, you remember that too. Peter, we've got a couple of seconds here. Are you prepared for today's class?
Well, I would just check the student body and make sure that they've left all their armor and their swords and their axes outside the classroom in case they don't like something, just like the battles with the Vikings.
Well, I think this will be interesting today because there's a lot of folklore out there on the Vikings and what happened in that time, and we're going to find some things out. And anybody knows any different, you be sure to call us because you can always challenge the school teacher at the Hedgerows.
Remember something, though, and for those who say they have other ideas, it's said by some of the historians that the entire notion of the Vikings in Ireland at sometimes reads like a fairy tale. And there is a mixture here and there of history, as well as it can be given to us for 1,000 years out, and legend. Because, you know, the Irish, I've never found a good story I didn't like to embellish.
That's a fact. That's a fact. Well, boy, I can't wait. Looks like everybody's seated in here. I think it's time to start the class right now on the Vikings. Well, you know, I looked at what brought this about with the Vikings and why it happened. And if you take a look at world history, there was a steady population growth in Northwest Europe, in Ireland, and in Scandinavia. And there was increasing trade going on, especially with Europe and Scandinavia. So the natural course for colonies and expansion was to go, come to the Isles and the Faroes and Iceland, and they just kept pushing out the Orkneys and the Hebrides. And that's where these folks started out, and those bases they used to come into Europe and into Ireland. And a couple of the reasons they give for another reason why this happened as it did, ships had been improved so they could sail better on the seas, and the Pictish Navy had collapsed. Now, the Pictish Navy is a subject for another day. I'm sure you'll agree.
Absolutely.
Yes, we'll be doing some research on that one.
So
or maybe
the Vikings were tremendous boat makers.
That's right.
And they were sleek and slim. And one of the things that I found, and I guess I knew it, but as we come further in history, people sailed. The Vikings didn't use sails, they used oars. So weather didn't impact them getting around.
Brute strength.
Yep. And, of course, if you think about where they're coming from, the Norsemen, the North, that was a major factor. So they had to get to themselves into the climates, into the conditions with which they were familiar, and so they used the oars.
That's right. And those keel boats, they say, they could sail on shallower waters, couldn't they?
Certainly, because they didn't have that deepness to them. They were long and slender.
That's right. And where they came from was Norway and Sweden. And then, of course, sometimes they're referred to as the Danes. What other names might they have been called?
In Denmark, well, they were the Norse.
That's right. The Norse, the Norsemen, something starts with an O there. What were they? The Ostmen, O-S-T-M-A-N, or M-E-N. And I can't remember where that came from, but it sure was one of the words they used. Now, I looked for the very first incursions of the Vikings, or as they were some kind called as a group. They just said Vikings, and that really was several separate groups of these folks from Scandinavia. But there was a raid in 617, that far back, by someone with a fleet of ships on the Hebrides and Northern Ireland. And who was it? Well, nobody knows. But the Norse had farmed and fished the Hebrides for some time, and that's on the natural route down. So that could have been the first raid, but the first written raid was of the Vikings. Happened about the same times as it happened on England and in Ireland. And the church on Lambay Island was burned. And on the west coast, the island monasteries of Innismurray and Innisboffin were plundered. And that same year, the monastery at Iona was attacked. And again in 802 and 806, when 68 of them were slain. Did you see any of that,
I know
Peter?
they say the most powerful attack by the Norse was about 794 also, and they in Irish waters. And they landed at Cracu, which is now Lambay off of Howth, which, of course, is just north of Dublin. And it was devastated. And then there's small islands out there in the Irish Sea off of Dublin, so they were doing that. And simultaneously, they also were launching attacks against South Wales.
Right. And have you noticed how these dates, depending on who you look at, they're like a year apart or 2 years apart for the very same event?
Absolutely. And that's one thing that people need to understand is the calendars. You know, even today, when we say it's 209, well, it might be. It's 209 since we established that that's when Christ was born. So we come forward with that. We also been celebrating the Jewish holidays. It's Jewish New Year. Just this weekend.
Yes.
The new year. So what do you have? You have this constant change of calendars and dates, and oftentimes dates were used depending upon who was in charge. And so their numbers depended. And even though as we go back and look and try to put into some sort of chronology what it is, the dates may vary year to year or day to day. And also when the calendar was actually changed in order to make up from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, and they took out 11 days. The English, where some of the things that we get about the Irish was changed, they took out 11 days in that year to match it up, so days get mixed up, and then times get mixed up. So we have to remember the calendars may not always be exactly accurate.
Just like the way an Irish name might be spelled changes quite a bit from the way it was in the Irish to the English and to the variations. Same way with place names and same way with dates. So you have to learn how to think.
Sure, and the Anglicization of words changed, and then the inability, or not the inability, but the non-permissibility of the English to the Irish at times they lost. They didn't know how to read and write all the time, and so some of it was forbidden. And then when it was rediscovered, we could say, then they searched in order to make the name real again.
Well, that was what happened at the end of the 8th century we just covered. Now let's take a look at the beginning of the 9th century. And if you look into the Annals of Ulster, it says that the Vikings came in and they burnt Innismurray, and they even penetrated into County Roscommon. This is the only account where they said they came that far inland that early, and some people say it might have been in error, but I'm not sure they would have made a mistake on that.
Now, when they came into Roscommon, they came in from the western side of Ireland. They come up the Shannon or off of the bays there from Sligo, and in the beautiful bays in Mayo and in Sligo right next to each other, and then Roscommon is the next county in.
Yes, and they were surprised because they never did it again, but maybe a brave band of Vikings just decided to see what was on the interior of the island.
And, of course, the beautiful thing is that if they had been going to Iceland, and as I've been discovering that they realized in Iceland that in Ireland was where there was wonderful fields and the ability for crops and if you've ever been to Roscommon, and I stayed a couple of weeks in Roscommon, it's beautiful. It's flatlands. It's not your tourist place. It's the flatlands of Ireland where so many crops are available.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about how the monastery at Iona was attacked successively and the people were killed. And that was sort of unique because those people from Iona, it split that church and they built anew at Kells in Meath, and that was completely rebuilt by 814. And at this time, the raids were mainly on northeast Ulster and the west coast, and things just seemed to be, they were just moved southerly every year. Now, if you go let's take the second decade, 812 or so, you've got reports of them moving into Mayo and Connemara and even down in County Kerry, where the Clan Owen was, and they had some confrontations with them. Things got a little quieter until 1821, and then we find mention of the raids on the Irish Sea and Howth over there on the eastern side, the eastern coast. So they're moving down both coasts now, all the way to the middle of Ireland, really, on the coastline.
The interesting thing about the Vikings is that they really stayed by the sea.
That's right.
And they were building forts because they were tradesmen and boatmen. And so that was very important. And so they were going back and forth from other places. Yes, they had even conquered what we know today as Normandy. And why is it Normandy? The Norsemen. That's why it's called that.
That's right.
And they were in England, and they were in Wales, and they were in Ireland, but they were always moving around. They made settlements.
And when was the next great invasion of Ireland after the Irish? Well, it was the Norse invasions, the Normans, in 1169. It was the Vikings again, just under another name.
That's right. And that always has amused me that when people talk about, the Vikings were there, and then, of course, the English came. It's the same. They were coming from. They had been all had been conquered years before.
That's right.
It was just the same. But the Normans. The Normans are Vikings mixed with the French.
That's right. Who had settled in there
500 years,
and they become acculturated. They became Christian, and then they came out again. That bloodline came right back out in them. That's very interesting. And, by 1823, since we're talking about 1823, by 823, since we're talking about that century, the Vikings actually had done the whole coastline of Ireland, north and south. They'd made a whole ring of the place, and they probably started to feel a little more confident about what they were doing.
The historian McManus said, in no other land in which these two peoples of such different culture came together did each learn so much from the other as in Ireland.
Boy, I think that's right. You can read it all. And isn't that where the saying came? They came to conquer Ireland, but in the end, they became more Irish than the Irish themselves.
More Irish than the Irish, which is an amazing thing, isn't it?
It's an amazing thing to say. How could it even be possible?
It's exactly.
Only in poetry.
Well, and of course, the Irish, what beautiful poets they are. But it's that wanting to find that beautifulness in that culture that even though you have yours and you see this, you want to adopt it.
Yeah, that's right. And by 823, Armagh was attacked twice in the same month. And that's a pattern you're going to see that seems a little strange at first. Why would you sack a place and then come back and do it again in the same month? And this happened quite a bit. And maybe that's because either they couldn't carry off all the loot they saw, or it was replenished so quickly it just came back there again.
Sure. And Armagh is a beautiful city and hills. And I've been in Armagh. I was there last year, not this year. But to go through Armagh, just the way it sets and up from the higher hills, you can see the plains and the coasts of Ireland. And it's so gorgeous. And they were attracted, too, by what the land was, by how it and what it could produce for them.
That's right. And wasn't Armagh a important ecclesiastical center?
Was the center that, if we're talking about the Vikings, in the 800s, 900s, 10 and 1100s, Saint Patrick, established his see. And in Christian thought, the see is the diocese. He established it there. And Armagh is seen to this day as the Catholic and the Anglican high seat in Ireland.
Well, that's even, I think, old Brian Boru ended up with a lot of connections there. He donated to that church.
He's buried in that church.
Right, and we're going to talk a lot more about him in another an episode. There's a great story there, but let's sort of summarize here. Between 795 and 836 or so, the Vikings, they made a bunch of very fast and small hit-and-run tactics. They were used against the Irish areas. And the Irish couldn't defend the whole coastline. They were lucky enough to just defend a particular city on a particular day. And they weren't that united, as we all know. But the Irish did fight back. Now, they lost a lot of battles. But in 811, a raiding party was slaughtered by the folks up in Ulster. And in 812, the OLaughlin, that's the Donahues, that area there around Killarney and whatnot. They also are recorded as slaughtering a raiding party. So there were some little points of of defense and fighting back. But overall, the Vikings were having their way, and the Irish weren't united against them.
Not at all. And, of course, the Vikings were better armed for battle than the Irish were. The Vikings, in fact, taught the Irish some things about battle with axes and swords that the Vikings brought with them. But the Vikings weren't just sea robbers. They were also merchants. And because they controlled the seas, trade was in their hands. And they did that from Limerick and Dublin to other ports. They went to France. They were in Spain. And they exported Ireland's products as well as importing other products to Ireland, like wheat and wine, silk, leather. And they hoped to introduce almost fashion into Ireland. So the Vikings, there's a good and the bad, as there is in all stories. But the Vikings weren't all these horrible people. They were looking for food, and they were looking for women. And it was the men had the dominance, of course. But the Vikings brought things, and then, as we said, they became like the Irish themselves.
Take a look at society and the church and what impact this might have had on them at an early date dealing with the Viking incursions. And, at first they say these raids were just scattered, and it might have been about one a year. Now, if you look in some other people's writings, they'll say one a year, but that's really not right. If you look closer, it was about one a month in the early days. So, and it wasn't all in the same kingdom, so nobody knew where they were going to strike next. And the inland people were pretty much safe, though they didn't have to worry. And life sort of went on because there were many more acts of violence between the clans, many more attacks between the Irish themselves on themselves than there were the Vikings. So this was just one more point of violence in society at that time. And the trade and the colonizing, like you say, that was the big positive for those Vikings, and that might have helped things a little bit. But the one, who was hurt the worst? The monks. That's who got raided the hardest, and they had the fear, and they put that in writing. So some of what we have today is a little slanted. Not that it wasn't true, but that it was just a partial picture of where really the worst of the battles were taking place.
And when in Ireland, there's round towers are all over the place, and when we get later to others we find in Glendalough or in they're all over the country. Glendalough has one of the most prominent. And they were very, very tall towers where the door was 20 foot from the ground. And these were where the monks would take their food, and they would go in them. And then when they could see from the top who was coming to invade, and they also protected themselves from that. And, of course, remember the old adage that the Irish saved Western civilization. And the premise of that, of course, is that the monks, the Irish monks, were able to hold on to all the old writings, and the Vikings weren't able to pillage it because the monks were protecting it.
That's true. And I also, talking about that, saving civilization, I read in one resource here that they say that really a center for intellectual thinking and writings was in the province of Leinster and there around Dublin, but because of these invasions and the constant warfare between the Vikings and the Irish, that it moved into the Shannon Basin. And I had never studied that before, but I thought that was a very interesting point. I'll have to look at that closer as time goes on.
I think we should mention, of course, that today, and you said Leinster, we should know that in Ireland at this present time, the present geographical divisions, there are 4 provinces: Ulster, Munster, Connaught, and Leinster. Leinster, east, mid. Munster, south. Connaught, west, semi-north. Ulster, very north. There was also, in the old days, Meath, which was really center, just north of Dublin. There was also Oriel and Ailishk.
Yeah.
But those were also what became Ulster. Meath is a county, but no longer a province. So there's just 4 provinces now, and the Vikings were at the ports in these major provinces. And,
one interesting thing is the North was pretty proud of keeping the big-time Viking settlements out. Well, there were some settlements, but there weren't Viking towns. They didn't have the power base. They were more like part of the community, and they thought it was good at the time, but as people look back on it, they missed out on the trade and the cultural refinement and the mixture with the rest of Europe. So they say in the long run, that actually ended up weakening the northern kings and the armies there. And, if we take a look at the development of the church and society a little further, I think, Peter, you know a little bit about this too, but the church had, with the rise in population and trade, the church was already becoming powerful and wealthy with just a little bit before the coming of the Vikings even, and they just sort of grew along with it. And they had hereditary offices for the church, and there was a lot of nepotism practices, and the leader of the land would have his brother run the local abbey, and that sort of thing. Did you read anything about that?
Well, first of all, the church in Ireland in the first millennium was really its own church. Patrick in the 400s. Well, Rome only started to gain its power at the same time, even though it was then recognized after Constantine that Rome would be the center for the church. Missionaries who were preaching Christ went out and established their own kind of domains. But one of the reasons that royal families, no matter what they are, if that means a tribal leader, if it means the head of a small group, the person who's in charge controls then the money, because even the peasants, so to speak, pay a homage, and that could be in food and everything that might be needed to be considered wealth. Well, then those in the church, they were the learned one. They were sent. When you talk about, as we will later, Brian Boru, he was sent to a monastery in Clonmacnoise, and it's an awfully magnificent place. It was one of the centers of learning. And the monasteries became the place where you went to become somebody. And still in the old Irish tradition, not anymore, but in the older Irish tradition 50, 60 years ago, the oldest son or the second son went to become a priest.
Yes.
And the oldest daughter might go to become a nun. You went to a monastery. That became part of the culture.
In those monastic cities, they had people gather around them, and the wealth was there, and the physical wealth was there. And anytime that happens, that's when trouble comes in on a temporal plane, because the Irish kings would attack these monasteries of their opponents who were contributing people and funds to their Irish opponents in the war. So they attacked them not so much as a religious attack, but as attack on the wealth and someone who was helping their enemy.
It's true, and the part of it is that originally, when the Irish were there before the Vikings came, they had established these places of learning, and Ireland was a very peaceful country amongst themselves. Yes, there's a battle here and there. Greed sneaks in. It's like saying there wasn't any crime. Of course, there was, as we define it today. And when the Vikings came, they became the outsider. So you had to protect yourself from the outsider. Well, not only was that outsider from another land, he also had different religious background. And he wasn't going to come in and tell the Christians, who were followers of Patrick, that they shouldn't do what they're doing. And so wealth then also became in these stoned walls, in these monasteries, magnificent structures, to travel around Ireland and see the many, many old, and by old I'm saying 1,000 years, and then later just 800 and so, where these settlements were. But they were centers of learning, they became centers of wealth, they became places of safety. And the Irish grew with that. But oftentimes then in the Irish background, the leader, who would be, say, the tribal chief, well, his brother or his son may wind up being the abbot or the bishop of the local area. And that's not a far-gone conclusion, because when Rome the empire too, and became a part of the church and recognized it, bishops got leadership roles in the government as well as in the church. So there was almost like a merger between the two, and the same thing happened in Ireland.
Well, I think that brings us to a good breaking point. We're going to come back with part 2 of the Vikings in Ireland, and that's when raids intensified and things kept going down a certain path. We'll talk about it more then. We're sure glad you came with us for this little session of the Hedgerow, and we're going to come right back with part 2 of the Vikings in Ireland. So ends this chapter of Irish history from the Hedgerow. The entire series is